In order to use the laser in the mill lab to etch a relief plate, we have to make sure that our file is set up correctly. I've got a file already open. This is a drawing that I did, and it's a photograph of the drawing. If you did a physical drawing in ink, the best way to get a file of that, other than to shoot a photograph of it, preferable to that, is actually a scanner. And we have scanners in our printmaking lab as well as in the ADRC on the third floor. So once you've got a good scan or a good photographic documentation of the physical drawing, we want to open that file in Photoshop. Now, let's say you did the drawing digitally, either in Photoshop or using a tablet and pen in Procreate or some other application like that. We'd simply then open that file in Photoshop, assuming that it's already pretty high contrast. Now, I've altered this file just a little bit, and I'll show you more alterations that you may need to do to your file. One of the first things we should do, though, is look at our file size. So I don't think this is in your view, but it's in the drop down for Photoshop at the very top. I'm going to go to Image and Image Size, and it brings up this dialog box. Right? So this shows me the physical size in inches. Of course, if yours isn't in inches, you can change it to that. And then it shows me the resolution, which is 300 pixels per inch, which is pretty good for what we want. Somewhere around 300 pixels per inch is what I would say is a good place to start. Now my image is only 6.5 inches by about 10 inches. And ideally what I'd want to do is create that to scale, especially if I'm working digitally, say with Procreate and a tablet. I'd want to go ahead and set that up right away and make sure it's the size that I want it to be. But let's say you did a small ink drawing, maybe half size, and you need to scale it up. This is where you would do that as well. When you scan your image, you'd want to scan it in at a pretty high resolution. So let's say my image was half size, and I need to make it twice that size. Rather than scan it in at 300 pixels per inch, in the scanner application, I'd probably choose 600 pixels per inch so that when I scale it up to twice the size, it'll be 300 pixels per inch at that size. We can also add a bit of resolution to a certain degree. I'm going to scale this a little bit, thinking that, okay, as large as I can possibly etch an image on the laser is 18 by 32. Okay, we're working relatively small in most cases. We're working 9 by 12 or 8 by 10, so that's what size you would set it at. But in this case, I'm going to make mine a little bit larger, I think. Let's see, maybe around 15 by 22. That's not too bad. I think actually I'll go a little bit smaller than that. I think making it 20 is probably pretty good if I want it to fit on a 15 by 22, maybe even a little smaller than that. Let's say 19. There we go. Now one thing you noticed perhaps when I was doing this is that my resolution also changed. It was 300 pixels per inch, now it's 158, which is a little bit low. And the reason it changed is that I didn't have this little box Resample checked. Right? Resampling essentially means if I'm scaling down to throw away pixels that I don't need and hence I can't ever get back, or add pixels where there aren't pixels. Right? This isn't like putting an image on a photocopier and scaling it up that way. Right? It's a little different than that. Photoshop has to think about the pixels that make up that image, right? So if we can even zoom in on this, right? It's a high contrast black and white image. Here's the pixel information, right? Where every pixel is either white, black, or in this case, different ranges of gray. And so when we scale it up, right, it's not making the pixels bigger. We have the same size pixel. It is really just figuring out what do I need to fill in, or what does Photoshop need to do to fill in pixel information there. So it's making up pixels, essentially. And so if you scale something to 3 times its actual size, you're asking Photoshop to make a lot of pixel information up out of thin air. And so that's why images can get fuzzy and blurry, right? Now, when we downsample, which would be shrinking it, making it a smaller image, let's say, that's much less of a problem. Unless I need to make sure that I don't get rid of pixels that I want back. Right? So in other words, if I shrink this down to half the size it is, it's going to throw away pixels. Right? And then if I scale that back up, it doesn't get those same pixels back. It actually invents pixels again. So you are destroying the pixel information when you're downsampling, when you're reducing the size. So be aware of that. And whenever you're working in Photoshop, it's a good idea to save different versions of the file. So you should have an original version, and then when you change things, save a new version. So you can always go back to the original if you need it, right? In this case, again, because I'm scaling up a bit, almost twice as large as it originally was, it makes my resolution pretty low. So what I want to do is bring some more resolution back. I want to hit Resample, and then I'm going to put in 300 pixels per inch. And you have actually ways of picking how it resamples, how it adds pixels where there aren't any. And preserving detail, this default 2.0 is typically a good way to do that. So I'm going to say OK. And yes, you can see that it started to get blurry and fuzzy. Right? You really see it up here. If I undo that and we look at that area, it's already a little fuzzy because it's a photograph and it's a bit out of focus. So there's only so much that we can do without distorting or losing information. So I'm going to again scale this, but not quite so large. Let's say 14. And what does that give me? Well, it's on Resample. So you can also see how the file size changes, right? This was a 17.2 megabyte file. Now it's a 33.6 megabyte file. Okay, so it's making it a larger file. When I don't have Resample checked, and I'm going to reset that. To reset this, you just hold down the Option key on your keyboard. I'll hit Reset. I'm going to get rid of Resample. I'm going to change this to, what I have, 14, I believe. Now you can see it's a little over 200 pixels per inch, and the file size is still the same. It's just rearranging the same number of pixels, right, into a larger or smaller size. So that's what you want to do first, is get your physical size correct and make sure it's at a decent resolution. Now 200 isn't terrible. It really just depends, I think, on the image itself and the detail that you have. Some images it may not make much difference at all. In other images that have very fine details, it may make a lot of difference. For the sake of this demo, I'm just going to leave it the size it currently is. Say I'm happy with that scale. That's what I want it to be. You can see that because this was a photo, I sharpened it a little bit. Here's what it looked like before. If I zoom in on it, the photo wasn't great. Again, a scan is going to give you the best resolution. So here I've sharpened it a bit. That helps. It's still not going to be as good as if I scanned the original well. Okay. The next thing we need to do is make sure everything is black or white as much as possible. Again, if I zoom in on this and we look at this in terms of the pixel information, you can see here are some pure white pixels. All these other light pixels are a light gray. And then this is maybe closest to a black pixel. All these other pixels are kind of a light gray. So I want to try to make those blacks black, and I want to try to make those whites white, but they don't have to be absolute. I can have some really dark grays in there. I can have some really light grays in there. We really want to do this always with an eye towards the image and the quality of the image, right? Because we can change the quality of the image, the mark making itself, if we make it too high contrast. So if I go to image adjustments, we can use levels or curves typically to do this, right? And the other way to do that same thing without destroying pixels or changing the pixels in a way we can't change them back, we could do it as a layer. So instead of image adjustments, I'm going to layer and new adjustment layer, and I'm going to go to levels. And now in the layers panel right here, I've got a levels adjustment. So what this is charting in levels is all of your pixel information from black to white. There's 256 different pixels there. So in this particular image, I've got a ton of pixels in the image that are not white, but light gray and kind of between middle gray and white, right? And then I have much less information that is from that light gray over to a very, very dark gray. So here's my black slider. I'm going to move it over. And you see if I move it all the way over, it's changing every pixel and making it dark, right? You see a little bit of color there. That's because we're in RGB mode, okay? So I'm going to try to make all of my blacks darker without starting to fill in some of the whites. So I might even zoom in on this a little bit and see what happens, right? You can see it starts to kind of get filling in. Those lines get wider as well as darker. So maybe about there is not bad. Now I'm going to move the white slider to do the same thing. I'm going to try to make those whites all much, much lighter, right? And of course I can move the gray, middle gray slider, and that will make a difference as well. Let's say I like that. I can turn this on and off to see if I've changed the quality in any significant way. And no, it looks pretty good. Of course, curves will do this. You can do this with image adjustments, brightness, contrast. That's kind of like the most rudimentary way to do it, as well as threshold. Right? Threshold is going to make everything purely black and white. Oh, it's on the wrong layer. There we go. I got to select the layer of the image, and now if I go to threshold, you'll see, yeah, it makes it super high contrast, but it also gets really pixelated, right? And we don't necessarily want that for this particular image. If I turn this on and off, you can see again the difference. So that, I would say, is changing the quality of the lines and the marks. So we're going to leave it like this for now. I think that looks pretty good. In fact, maybe even before I do this, I might go ahead and just make it grayscale first, so I don't get any of those color halos there. And I want to flatten it. I want to discard the color. And now let's look at our contrast. That's not bad. You can see we get some dark grays in there. Again, I think that's more the quality of my photograph than the file. But that may be very true of what you're working on as well. So you're going to have to kind of do a little give and take. So what happens when the laser gets a file and it etches a wood block? In this case, we're using a block MDF. Anything that's black, it will cut. It will burn, and it will burn to a certain depth. Let's say the max depth is like 1/4 of an inch, or 1/8 of an inch probably. It's even less than that. But let's say it's 1/8 of an inch. When any pixel that's black, it'll burn to 1/8 of an inch. Any pixel that's white, it's not going to burn at all. And so any of the grays that are in there will burn to different depths. So if we get a light gray, it'll burn a little bit. If we get a dark gray, it'll burn closer to 1/8 of an inch. So those grays can make a difference in what our image turns out like. And of course, in printing, in printmaking, and in making this relief block, we need it to be graphic. So the more graphic we can make it, the more predictable it will be. And regardless of whether it's graphic or not, the file, the laser will cut different depths. And then when we print it, we put ink on it, it's going to become graphic. So if it's very, very graphic, everything is either black or white, then it's going to be really predictable. We should get exactly what the file looks like when we print it, or very, very close. If it's got grays, then we won't know exactly what it'll look like until we print it, right? Sometimes that's a positive thing, and sometimes that's a negative thing. So don't stress too much about getting rid of all those grays. Like I did, I've still got some grays in there. So let's say this looks pretty good, okay? The thing we know about the laser, of course, as I said, is that it's going to burn away the black. And in this case, we want the black to print, right? That needs to be the top surface of the relief block. And we want the white to be removed or burned away. So what we want to do then is, let's go ahead and flatten this image, merging these two layers. Okay. And now let's invert this image. So if we go to Image, Adjustments, Invert, or the keyboard shortcut is the Apple or Command button I. We've made what's white black and what's black white. That's exactly what we want. You can see from my photograph it was a little bit darker up here, right? So I want to make that also black, either by making an adjustment with levels, or in this case I'm just going to take the paintbrush and I'm just going to paint that area in black because I want that to get cut away. Let's see, I'll take this off an airbrush setting there. So now it should just be a hard black. So you may have to do this as well on your scan. Look at areas that didn't quite come out like you want. I need to crop this too, it looks like. Got some of my pins that are showing. So you can go in and doctor some as well. That'll make it, again, a little easier. Let me go to the crop tool, and I'll just bring this up a little bit. Whoop. Got a quick trigger finger here. There. That looks pretty good. And if I zoom in on this, I can see those details. Another thing you certainly can do is invert it first and then do your adjustment. So you could see, okay, everything that's white is what's going to print. I want to look at the quality of that versus kind of the black of the marks. Now another thing that's true of relief is that we're going to get a inversion, right? Meaning that this arm of the figure that's on the right side, when we put it on the block and we print it, if the arm is on the right side on the block and we ink this up, the paper that we pull off, the arm will be on the left. And this part of the elbow of this figure and this word bubble, which is on the top left, when it's printed on paper, it'll be on the top right. So what you see is not what you get in both, that the image needs to be in negative and it needs to be flipped horizontally. So we'll do that next. I can go to Edit. It looks like it's not going to let me do that because I have to select all of the image, and then using the transform tool here under Edit, I can flip horizontally. Boom. There we go. And so now our file is essentially ready to be placed in the app. Well, one other thing we need to do actually, before we do that, we don't want to get out of ourselves. If it's in grayscale, I want to make this an RGB file. Okay, and if I don't do it here, I can do it when I place the file. Okay, so now we'll do a file save as, and I'm going to put this just on my desktop. And we'll call this relief plate test. There. What file format should we save it in? Well, we could save it as a JPEG, or we could save it as a Photoshop document. JPEG is good for compressing the file, for making it smaller, but it's not a file format we want to save something in again and again and again, because every time it compresses the file, it throws away information, so it degrades the image. So saving it as a JPEG once or twice is not a big deal. Over time, though, it can degrade the pixel information. If we save it as a Photoshop document, it would be fine. It's going to be a little bit larger, and it's a native file format. I'll go ahead and save this one as a JPEG since it already is. And I'm going to make it a copy so it doesn't save over my other file. I'll say save. I'll leave the compression rate pretty high, or actually the compression rate low, the file size high. Say OK. And that should be good. Next, we need to bring that file into Illustrator and prep it on an artboard so it's ready to be engraved.